biodiversity is being lost at a very rapid rate. And in US, we have probably very few primary forests left. They are mostly secondary growth here. So in Africa, we still have primary forests. In Latin America, in Peru, Amazon, we still have some primary forests. Once we lose them, probably we can grow biofuels, or we can grow these, like other kinds of trees that can provide us some economic value. But whether we would have the same diverse web of life there again as the way we have now, and whether that's an irreversible thing or reversible thing, that's the largest uncertainty that we face. And what would happen to the larger hydrological cycle of the planet or the carbon cycle of the planet after we lose these primary forests? Those are also some very large uncertainties that we face. So the question is that whether we just keep on going the way we are now in terms of trying to protect these biodiversity hotspots through these management options that are not working, or do we change? So the question is, at least we say that the current management option is not working. We need to change. Now the question is, what kind of change do we do? That's a question of discussion. But at least we're saying is that we need to have local people on board for, if we want to make any important decisions, we need to bring them on the table and engage them in a way which is respectful, which is humbling, which gives them space on the table, and we listen to them authentically. Yes. The problem is that if you ignore the local people's concerns, then we are stuck with the business as usual. I mean, the national parks have been set up in Africa, but they are not working in terms of protecting the biodiversity. There is a lot of history that I'm talking about in terms of the power processes that these local communities have gone through, at least in Africa. And they remember that history when we talk to them. And the problem is that it's because of that history that these business as usual scenarios of just maintaining national parks or imposing national parks on these people is not helping in terms of protection of biodiversity.
How much of Costa Rica is in protected areas? Oh, come on, come on. You've been looking at too much of the marketing material.
10%.
25%. 25% is the usual, marketing figure that is given. But what is not marketed, because it's kind of a complex concept to sell, is the fact that the country actually in the mid-90s, around 1996, embraced a model that it calls CNAC, or the National System of Conservation Areas. And what CNAC implies is that the whole country is going to be divided in 11 bioregions, and that those 11 bioregions are going to be managed as such. So the whole landscape, the whole grid of the landscape will be harmonized in a way that the conservation that is happening in the protected area systems will be actually in, sort of rhyme with the rest of the land uses that you can find there. There may be an airport. There may be actually a dam. There may be, tourism development. It is unreal to think that none of these is going to happen. So what would you prefer? What is the menu of things that you prefer? Would you think that a management plan is something that is appropriate to have here or not? Would you rather have no control over the use of the wetland in order to fully develop your ventures or not? And that way we were able to actually introduce into the different development scenarios the environmental service valuation, so they could see something tangible in which they could actually, give an opinion.
What megacity is okay and what megacity isn't okay? And is greenwashing, and where does greenwashing fall in this whole discussion? Where is it real and where is it not real? And does it matter? And maybe none of it matters. Maybe it all has to go back to a different human scale.
In the Comprehensive Energy Plan, there are action points. I haven't read the whole plan, but I read far enough in to see, the first action point is to investigate the use of alternative indicators. And there's a little sidebar box that mentions GPI specifically, mentions that other states are adopting it. have adopted it or investigating it, and mentioning that there's ongoing work at the Gund Institute doing a GPI Vermont. So we're on their map, and the state is moving in this direction. So, what do we do now? Oh, well, we compiled the GPI, but thus my interest in getting the wisdom of the group about particular elements of it and ways we might tinker and improve it. The point of this is, let's measure, we're trying to get at sustainability. Like, decrease in natural capital is not sustainable. You can't draw down a capital account forever in any one of these areas. Well, another whole way to measure sustainability is to look at, once you model the economy as a thermodynamic system, as ecological economics does, you see it's got inflows of matter and energy. And the amount of inflow determines how much matter and energy output there is. So you could ask the question and maybe develop indicators. What do you think? Is this possible, feasible? Would this be good? To develop indicators that measure how much of the matter and energy inflow in the economy is sustainably sourced. That probably would be strongly related to how much of the high entropy output is biologically absorbable. But you could have a separate measure for that just in case they're not connected. And that would give you a quick read on where we are on the scale of sustainability. Like a society that's 100% sustainable gets 100% of its matter and energy from renewable sources. So at some level, at some point, we got to figure out what's the proper mix between built capital services, natural capital services, and social capital services. We have to answer that question. We can't begin to ask that question effectively till we have indicators that measure all three. So I guess I am saying the answer will become obvious with experience with the right indicator.
So what I want to say here with this work is that to assess ecosystem services, we need to pay attention to who the beneficiaries of the services are and where they're at, and what the paths are, what pathways transmit the service from the ecosystems provided to the people which receive it. Okay. So the thing that moves, right, but the service is detrimental or beneficial. In the case of wildfire, you're flowing a detrimental carrier, you're moving a threat. Therefore, the thing that provides the service is the sink. That's the thing that provides wildfire regulation or flood regulation. In the case of provisioning or beneficial flow, in that case, the provisioning region is the good thing. And sinks are bad because they prevent you from getting more of the thing that you want. So it has to do with where you assign value, to sources or to sinks in the landscape. But it all has to do with how much provides the user. Any other questions before I keep running with it? Because I'm going to go into this in more detail.
That's kind of like water quality too, right? Where you have something that's generating clean water and then the sink is actually could be polluting it.
Exactly. So in that case, the sink, exactly. So you have like a 100% water quality value, or whatever it is when it starts. And when it hits there, the quality value gets decreased as it hits pollution locations. So in that case, the sinks are bad, the sources are good, and then we want to assign the negative value to the sinks and the positive value to the sources.
So if you're trying to find the ecosystem service value for thinning,
yep.
Right.
It's going to have to do. It's going to have to do assessing sinks. I'm going to show you actually some really cool maps.
Even though it's also at the
that.
source. It's both the sink and the source.
There's two parts to this, right? Because I don't want to conflate a baseline assessment and a scenario. Okay, if you thin something and then rerun the scenario or the assessment, and you compare two scenarios, one in which you had a depressed source, then you can say there's this much more service generated in this case than in this case, or this much less threat in this case and this case. But that's a scenario delta as opposed to a delta due to the current configuration of the landscape. So we do a baseline assessment and then we do scenarios for either increasing or decreasing sources, sinks, or rechanneling flow paths. You guys got that?
So the water flowing, so there are two types of sinks. So like dirty water flowing over a forest, that's a good sink.
Yes.
And then flowing past a sewage plant, that's a bad sink.
Yes. So it goes up and down. Applying a value on top of that is the next step that you do at the end of the simulation. But the purpose of this work is to try and connect together on a per region basis. You want to be able to answer the questions, where do I, user, get my services from? And the other question, who gets services from that piece of land? So we really want to get the spatial connectivity piece in there because then we can actually say something about who's liable for different services, who's dependent upon which things, who's going to lose in the event of change to a public good, et cetera, et cetera.
It can take some weird developments when you try to find such a tailor-made approach for a certain region, because region is not a well-defined, it's not like an administrative, because landscape is like something that is in between like natural boundaries and administrative boundaries, and we have to find a compromise.
To begin with, before you can design any kind of policy, you got to figure out what your policy goals are. What do you want to achieve? And what we clearly, in my mind, what we clearly want to achieve is this idea of, ecological economics. So ecological sustainability, which really is a steady state throughput. The rate at which we extract raw materials from nature, convert them into economic benefits and services, and spew them back as waste into nature cannot be increasing on a finite planet, and I would actually argue it has to be dramatically lower than it currently is today. Dramatically lower. For CO2 emissions, at least an 80% reduction, probably quite a bit more. When economists talk about efficiency, they mean one very specific thing. They mean maximizing monetary value, in which case it's far more efficient to give food to an overfed American than to a malnourished African, because I'm willing to pay more for it, and therefore that maximizes monetary value. I don't buy into that definition of efficiency at all. A lot of people have written about these ideas, always with the goal of stimulating economic growth. All the stuff about local currencies, how do we stimulate economic growth? And so when you flip it around and suddenly you're trying to not only reduce economic growth, but shift it from growth of private consumption to growth of public goods, including, natural capital and all that. I don't know enough. I love Herman's quote that people who think they understand money probably haven't studied it enough. All media is going to be driven for profit, which means everything we see, even newspapers, everything, it's got to be able to sell this idea that you will consume more, otherwise it can't pay for itself. And if they're going to be effective at it, they've got to be fundamentally changing our values to believe that we are insatiable, that we need that vacation in northern Canada, or we need this other, that we're not satisfied being here, we need more crap.
And so I'm really glad to see ecological economics emerge, that through finding out about it through conferences, through reading, and then of course when the gun came here and John Erickson came here. So that's been exciting for me to see somebody who does question some of those assumptions and the whole paradigm. So talk about story for just a second. You said what does story have to? What part of the reason, again, I think gun and ecological economics is important is because it's helping to tell a new story, a different story, and say, well, we have climate change, we have all the stuff that's going on in the world with loss of biodiversity and deforestation and desertification of sub-Saharan Africa, and people dying of starvation. Every 4 seconds another person dies. All these kind of things. What you're talking about stories? You got to be kidding. Well, let's listen. So again, we know about, if you're familiar with David Corton, with Joanna Macy, others, whatever term you use, whether it's great turning or whatever, the necessity for a paradigm shift, for telling a new story or a myth. A lot of times you think, well, yeah, stories are important for Native Americans, and they're important for the Maoris in New Zealand, or for the Aborigines in Australia. Well, they're important for us too. They're ways of any society, any culture, understanding who they are a little bit better. So one of the problems is we know all too well that the model that we have right now, the story that we're telling right now, is not working. So as it says there, a culture is going through a crisis because the story is no longer adequate to explain. All the trends about environmental degradation and social instability are a result of this failing cultural story. And we know all too well, just with a lot of the work of the gun, in terms of this story that we're telling is, growth at all costs. The economy is it can grow infinitely. You don't have to worry about limits and so forth. That story doesn't work. You are what you own. You are what you wear. You are how much money you make. All that's part of our story. Our story, to a large degree, is told by for-profit businesses and advertisers, who are the kind of the handmaidens of for-profit businesses. And so many times we don't take control of our own story.
But the overall picture again looks like the fraction that biomass could deliver to a renewable energy, future energy portfolio pass its limits. The question now is, what do you take out of this? Does it mean that biomass doesn't make sense? We should drop this, we should look for other solutions because it's useless, it's such a small fraction? Or do you think that the problem is that we just use a lot of energy and we should reduce our energy consumption, and therefore also these renewable energy sources, which are fairly small, would increase in their share over time? We could of course discuss by what extent. Or also what additional sources of renewable energy you could tap into the future, and how a future energy portfolio would look like. Right now you have, for the whole of the US at least, you have a huge chunk of oil and of coal for electricity production, and hydro of course, but it's dominated by a couple of big players. But the future energy portfolio may look very different, where you have a lot of small sources that all add up to the big pie in the end. But for me, for my personal conclusion for that is also that in the first case, and that's nothing new, in the first case you need to work on reducing your energy consumption. And then, of course, look also for additional fuels and sources.
It's the transition problem. Last night I went to a talk about forests and being used to fuel electric generation, which we do in this city. And if you start with a virgin forest, not that there are many of those around here, and you cut it, and then you start managing it on a rotational basis for biomass, because of the carbon that was initially there, not just in the biomass above ground, but also below ground. If you think about paying back the amount of carbon that's released when you first cut this and burn this, and you pay it back, or that is, take it out of the atmosphere by growing more trees, depending on how you do the calculation, it might take 50 years to save as much carbon as you have released when you cut that forest and burned it the first time. So in the long run, you've got a rotational scheme that's producing no net carbon. But in that 50-year time horizon, that thing isn't a source of carbon sequestration, it's the opposite. It's a source of carbon. So that's the dynamic problem. You can summarize that by a little chart like that, which I really love. This is time in that direction. And this is something, effort. The red is what you're investing in terms of energy or carbon or whatever, which means carbon into the atmosphere, to build something, to build some new program, some new technology. The green is the benefit you get from it as you go on, which in the case of many of these is reduced carbon emissions. So this is more from the construction of the thing, and this is less from the operation of the thing. The question is, how long does it take before the area here equals the area here? Until you get out to that point, you have not paid back that mess you've made. And these transitions are kind of ironic because the faster you want to go, the bigger the problem can be. It doesn't mean not to do it, but it also means you might want to start ranking things according to their payback. And when you talk about paybacks, the thing that has the fastest payback is behavioral change. Hit that light switch. Okay, right? Okay. After that, which is the toughest one, supposedly. And then after that, the technologies that have different paybacks and so on.
Economic model built on forever growth, which is what the economic model that we have is, simply isn't sustainable. It can't be. If growth requires that you keep up using resources. So we can't. So either we have to transition to something that allows growth to happen, but doesn't keep using resources, and there may be ways to try to think about that, and or we change our value system so that the continuous accumulation of goods is no longer the highest purpose of our lives. And I think it needs both. Not only do we not know what will happen, we do not even know what can happen. And that in turn means that reason, which is the highest human virtue of our beloved enlightenment, is an insufficient guide for living your life. If you don't know what can happen, you can't reason about it. But that frees us up in wonderful ways because it calls us to our full humanity. How do we do it? I mean, go ask people in the business world. How do you make business decisions? I've started 4 companies. You don't know what you're doing. You're out there trying to figure out what's going on, and you do stuff and hope that it works. Same thing in policy formation. So that means that we have reason and emotion and intuition and imagination, and strongly we have metaphor. And these are ways of bridging to what we can't talk about. So all of that's in front of us, and I think it's the bridge between the 2 cultures of the humanities and the sciences, and a lot more. It's an arrow into us addressing what our humanity is, which I think is the deepest task. How many goods and services are in the global economy now? Well, it's estimated that there's about 1 billion in New York. Okay, so maybe there's 10 billion goods and services in the global economy. Will we accept that? Because I really want to make a big point out of this. Yeah. Why did we get from 1,000 to 10 billion? How did that happen? The economists have no theory about it at all. None. I know, I've been arguing with them for 20 years. They have 0 theory. But I'm going to tell you that because I do. And I'm going to tell you the theory, but it matters to us because it's part of what's going on that you guys are struggling with. Okay? And to jump ahead, there's an onslaught of new goods and services, for a reason I want to try to show you in a minute, that is going to crowd up against the finite planet. And the question is why is there this onslaught of new goods and services? Well, that means we teach creativity. We teach people how to be creative. That means we change undergraduate education and our value system.
Typically, it's thought that the lower cost is reflecting fewer material inputs. But the question is, for me, does that equal lower ecological and human health impacts? At the in-home setting, so where I was in the facility. At the in-home setting, the nurses were trained to help, after a patient has died, they're trained to help the family get rid of as much stuff that they don't need as possible, and that was all the drugs. And there are so many drugs. It's this huge cocktail, 25 drugs a person sometimes, different types of drugs, and multiple pills. They were trained to dump all of that in the toilet. It all went down the drain. Amount of waste that's coming out of these places is that infection control policies outweigh any sort of environmental concern. So for example, a typical scene after someone dies in a conventional or palliative care setting would be that you would collect, there would be 3 bags of garbage, like 30-gallon bags of garbage. 2 of those bags would be completely unused items. Things that were brought into the room at the moment of death because you're trying to help that person and save that person and lengthen the life, whatever you can do. You bring all this stuff in, you don't use it because you didn't really need that one or that one or that one. But now it's in the room, and so it's considered contaminated, and it is infectious and it has to be thrown away. So infection control policy, huge governance question. The idea is that what we're seeing here is that conventional care has the highest impact, just based upon the amount of stuff and what it is that's going in. But here's the thing that I find most interesting to me. So we see that hospice and palliative care definitely have these lower cumulative impacts overall. We don't want to go into hospice because we're afraid of dying. But if we went in there, if we transfer in, when we have the time, if we transfer in there 6 months before we actually die, a lot of things happen. We would prefer to not die in the hospital. Hospice allows us to die not in the hospital. We have better pain and symptom management if we're in hospice because the physicians are trained to use narcotics more effectively. A lot of physicians in the conventional setting are afraid to use narcotics to the point that they are actually needed to be used to control pain when you're at the end of life. your family is happier when you are in hospice because they're getting a lot of social support that they don't get in the conventional setting. You won't be in the hospital for as long, and you can actually live longer. This was a study about, I think it was 6,000 case controls, so a patient and then a person who was a patient in hospice versus a patient who stayed in conventional care. Same diagnosis, they matched them up and they followed them through time to see what happens. I think it was about 6,000 people who were followed. If you have chronic heart failure, no, CHF, congestive heart failure, you live 81 days longer if you're in hospice. If you have lung cancer, 39 days longer if you're in hospice. Pancreatic cancer, which is pretty much a death sentence right now, you live for 3 weeks longer if you have hospice. Hospice is not necessarily a death sentence, but we equate it with being that. So